Morning, everybody. This video is going to be a little bit late, a couple hours late. So if you checked earlier this morning and it wasn't up, it's because I didn't get it done. My house is still currently under evacuation warning. The wind has picked up substantially, so we're on edge. So that explains my lateness and also the fact that I'm wearing a hat because I just didn't have time to fix my hair before I made this video. So good morning. Otherwise, we're doing totally fine, just waiting it out, hoping that the fire keeps moving on by us, or not coming to us, actually moving other places or going out. So today we are talking about intersectionality, or this week I should say, we're talking about intersectionality in communities and social capital and how those sort of things all come together. Some of you have already used the word intersectionality, meaning you probably have realized that's a thing that we're going to talk about. A lot of you have used the ideas of intersectionality even if you didn't know what intersectionality was. So intersectionality being the idea that we carry multiple identities, not just one. So I'm not just a woman, I'm not just a queer person, I'm not just a professor, I'm a queer woman professor all the time. And so when we talk about those sort of things, we have different privileges and advantages and different sort of marginalizations that we experience, sometimes in different ways than people who are similar to us, sometimes in ways that are really different from people who look sort of similar to us in some ways, but in other ways, not so much, right? The fact that I'm a professor gives me a lot of privilege. I have a PhD. People believe me when I talk about things. I am white passing, and so people, again, believe me because I am a white-looking person, and so they assume that, of course, everything that I'm saying is factual and right. And so those things are just thought about. They're things that the PhD I did earn, but the fact that I have intelligence and the amount of intelligence that I have was not earned. It was just something I was born with, right? Just like the same as the color of my skin. However, I'm also a woman and I'm also queer. Both of those things tend to have some social disadvantages with them. And so in those sort of ways, I often get discounted because I'm a woman or because I'm a queer person. And so those are ways in which my privileges are absent. And so how does that make it sort of all work together? Well, it's a complicated sort of thing. My life as a queer, white passing woman with a PhD is different than a black woman who is queer and has a PhD, right? And so all of those sort of things work together in this really complex sort of interplay. And so the idea of that is intersectionality. Intersectionality was created as a term by Kim Crenshaw, who is actually a black woman with a PhD, talking about her experiences of working in higher education and how she experiences things different than a lot of her colleagues. We've used it as a term with her blessing to talk about other people's identities. And so that is where this idea of intersectionality comes. And that's why it's really important for us to talk about in terms of health equity. Intersectionality means people are going to have to navigate healthcare systems and preventative health stuff in a lot of different ways based on all of those sort of identities that they have. Some of the identities work together to make you even more privileged. Some identities work against each other to make it even harder. So we know that people of faith, right, oftentimes have the sort of stereotype that they are anti-LGBTQ. That's not always true. We know that there's lots of people who are people of faith who are embracing and inclusive of LGBTQ people, and we know that there's lots of LGBTQ people who embrace their own faith. But back to the stereotype, we know there's a lot of different religious sects that are like, ooh, we don't like LGBTQ people. And then we also know there's a lot of ways in which people of color are excluded from certain faith communities, right? So if you are a black gay person, maybe you're going into a church that is not super inclusive of your race, but is much better about your sort of sexuality. Or if you're going to go to a black church, a lot of black churches have some prejudice and stereotypes about LGBTQ people. Again, not all, but some do. And so then where is that person supposed to go? So should they go to a community that embraces their sexual orientation or a community that embraces their race? Which one is more important? They're equally as important, but they might not feel accepted equally in both places. differences. And so that is where intersectionality can come in to a really big sort of thing. So there's a Bob the Blue Stripe triangle metaphor that comes up on your lecture slides for this week. Part of the reason that we talk about intersectionality is to be able to talk about sort of strength in numbers. There are more of us who have sort of minority or underprivileged identities if we band together. And so my ideas of struggle should be bound up in somebody else's idea of struggle, even if our struggles are looking a little bit different. That is what gives us power, because if we're looking at just sort of minority issues, minority being a statistical sort of measure, well, if there's only 10% of us who are LGBTQ, or if there's only 20% of us that are Black, or if there's only 5% of us that are Native American, each of those little bits and pieces are really a small minority. But if we all band together and say, hey, we're all oppressed peoples, doesn't matter that our oppressions look different, but we're all oppressed together, so let's all work together to say, hey, oppression is just not cool anyway, and we should all be working on the fact that health equity is available for everybody, regardless of your different sort of identities and privileges or lack thereof. So this is connected to social capital. Social capital is the idea that we have. So capital is another word for sort of financial stuff. When people say, like, do you have a lot of capital? They often mean money. But when we talk about social capital is the idea that you have stuff that is of non-monetary value. And so social capital often is stuff that we can't see or touch. So your feelings of trust and safety, your sense of belonging, reciprocity. So whether or not you feel like, hey, if I do something good, someone will do something good for me. Citizen power, sort of your values, your norms, your outlook, your participation in society. All of those sort of things are a unique factor that comes together as social capital, right? And there's a really great video that talks about social capital in terms of how many connections that you have. So the way that social capital and intersectionality in health works is that based on sort of the social capital you have, you may be able to navigate health systems better than if you didn't have that social capital, right? We also know that socioeconomic factors have an impact on our social capital, right? If we're with a whole bunch of other poor people, so we live in a really low economic sort of area, probably all the people we know are poor, right? And so being able to access wealth and knowledge to go to college and navigate sort of financial systems is probably not something that's super easy for us, right? When we think about sort of the 1%, right? They are there because they all know each other, right? And so they're able to get money from each other, they're able to get recommendations from each other, and these sort of things. And so socioeconomic factors greatly impact our social capital, and our intersectionality impacts that, because the less sort of privileges that we have, the less connections that we have, the less likely we are to be able to navigate health systems, right? So some of the things that are sort of at the crux of intersectionality and social capital and health might be immigrants and acculturation. We have a video this week that talks about, as immigrants get more acculturated, they actually get less healthy, right? Which is weird, since we're supposed to be, the melting pot and all these sort of things. We'll talk about that later in the semester. But actually, as immigrant communities become a more acculturated in our society, they actually lose a lot of health. And so we find a lot of protective factors of people sticking close to their sort of culture and their home identities is actually a health protective factor. Right? The school to prison pipeline. So the idea that kids who are low income, and particularly kids of color, get punished at school, which leads to expulsions from school, which means eventually that they might end up in prison, right? That happens to students of color way more than anybody else, right? We have evidence-based sort of fact that kids of color get highly policed, not only in schools, but in communities. And so they're much more likely to get in trouble, which means they're much more likely to end up in prison than in college, right? And so that's why it's called the school to prison pipeline. The first place that they start getting in trouble is at school, and then that just continues on in their lifetime. And then they're on this path to sort of criminal justice system, rather than on this path to success and equity and going to higher education, right? Another place where we see sort of social capital and intersectionality happening is around insurance, right? The insurance system in this country is complex and it's really hard to navigate. And so for a lot of people, figuring out how to navigate the healthcare system is one thing, right? For a lot of people, the healthcare system is a series of appeals and denials and appeals and denials and going through all this sort of stuff, right? If you're not somebody who has been educated in how to read through sort of a insurance booklet, or you're not somebody who comes from a culture where it's okay to speak up to power and authority, if you have limited reading proficiency in English language, and that's all that you can get, all of those things might make it less likely that you would be able to appeal an insurance decision, which for a lot of people is just kind of a routine thing that we learn how to do. And so you just might go without care because you're like, well, the insurance company said no, so I guess I just won't get it. Not knowing that a lot of insurance companies deny claims in the beginning until you fight with them, right? And so if you don't have the social capital that helps you have people who navigate the system, who can read the things, who know these sort of things, well, then you're just going to be out of luck because you're not going to get that healthcare because nobody told you that you were supposed to do these sort of things, right? And so that is how social capital and intersectionality and health all work together. One last concept to talk about before I tell you about what you're doing this week is the concept of respectability politics. Respectability politics is this idea that in order for you to be worthy of respect or worthy of whatever, you need to show yourself as being sort of the best and being compatible. And so for one of the examples this week is looking at sort of black men, right? So the stereotype and again, the media image of black men is that they're all thugs, they all wear baggy pants, and that they all do these sort of bad things. And so if black men wear suits and they talk in standard English rather than using sort of AAVE or other sort of things, then they'll be more respected, right? Well, that's inherently not okay because everybody should be respected for who they are, not because they're able to fit into this idea of what respectable is, that a suit and tie is somehow better than baggy jeans and a do-rag, right? Or that certain sort of perfect English is more important than sort of vernacular or slang. Those ideas contribute to the idea that people are less worthy of things rather than saying like, hey, no matter what, they are humans and they are respectable because they're people, right? And we should give people sort of the benefit of the doubt. We should give them the rights and the human rights and the social rights that they should have, regardless of what they look like or regardless of how they appear or regardless of how they present themselves. And so that is a really big sort of concept. It's this idea that we have to look like sort of the standard, which is based on sort of the white male upper class sort of standard, and saying like, hey, there's actually no wrong or right way to be a human, and you're worthy of respect in any of those sort of formats, right? The fact that I apologize at the beginning of this video for saying like, oh, I'm wearing a hat and a t-shirt rather than looking nice, that's an idea of respectability politics. The idea that to be respected as a professor, I should be looking some sort of way and have all my hair done and my makeup done and all these sort of things, rather than being like, yo, I'm actually in the middle of a disaster zone, and so this is just what you get. I'm still good at my job. I'm still able to teach you, even if I don't have the sort of respectability of what a professor looks like, right? So how does this all come together? There's a really great example of how this all comes together. The Flint water crisis. So the Flint water crisis you've probably heard about, but you probably haven't heard a lot about it. For the most part, when I teach this in this class, most people haven't heard of all of the sort of nitty-gritty details of everything that went wrong in Flint. Everybody just knows Flint has bad water and there's bad things happening there. And so for this week, I'm going to have you watch a documentary that was put together in 2016 called Undrinkable, the Flint water crisis. And it talks about how the Flint water crisis unfolded. And I really want you to pay attention to the ways in which intersectionality, social capital, and respectability politics all work together to create this really shitty situation that happened in Flint. The documentary ends in 2016 with lots of hopeful sort of stuff, but sorry, it's still not super hopeful. I have some links in the presentation about some things that happened after the documentary, but the short sort of answer is Flint still doesn't have clean water. They still haven't made all the fixes. People in Flint are still dealing with these after effects 8 years later. And so I really like to use this documentary as a way to say, let's look at these sort of concepts this week of intersectionality, of respectability politics, of social capital. How did lack of these sort of things lead directly directly to the Flint water crisis that ended in a lot of people having really poor sort of health outcomes. Okay, so I will see you next week.